we had Jesse Ventura on the program a couple of days ago, and he came on here, and he's got his conspiracy theories, and, he's got his new book, American Conspiracies, etc. I avoided the whole 9/11 thing. We talked to him about that before. It's a headache, okay? So we got into his other conspiracies, one of which was about the media, or how the media is complicit in this. Now, I find that to be one of the most reasonable so-called conspiracies, and I've explained before on the show, it's not people getting together in a smoke-filled room. At least from my perspective, I don't see it that way. I think that the system selects the people who will play ball. If you don't play ball, you get moved out. If you do play ball, you get promoted. Okay, it's very simple, and that's a conspiracy that's fairly out in the open, if you will, right? And it's systemic. So that we had that conversation. But as part of that conversation, Ventura talked about how he was on, he got a contract from MSNBC after he stopped being the governor of Minnesota. And he said that once they found out that he was against the Iraq War, they said, okay, no, that's it. You don't have to do the show. We'll just keep paying you. But we got to shut you up so you don't go anti-war on our air, right? Now, I posted that interview on Daily Kos. And guess who responded? Keith Olbermann. And Keith said, look, I was at MSNBC at the time, and that's not how it went down. That's very interesting. So, and of course, I trust both their perspectives. What I mean by that is I believe that Ventura actually thinks it went down like that, and I believe Olbermann thinks that it went down the way he says it. So let me tell you his side, and then you can decide. Olbermann says, look, I was there, and the show was a wreck, and Jesse's a great guest, but when you have him host the show, he just can't do it. And they tried to figure out different ways of accommodating him, maybe have another host in there who pitches the news to him, and then he responds to it, etc. And I know someone that was involved in that process. So I know that there's certainly at least a good deal of validity to at least the idea of that they had a co-host pitching the stories, etc., right? And he says, so there was no great conspiracy. It's just Jesse wanted to do the show from Minneapolis, and it was going to cost an arm and a leg, and he wasn't very good at it, right? Okay, maybe. And then we got into a conversation back and forth on Daily Kos. And that's one of the great things about Daily Kos, that you could do that, right? And I responded, and I said, well, okay, how about the other things? How about Phil Donahue? How about Ashley Banfield? And Olbermann said, look, on Phil Donahue, he knows that Donahue says that, he was against the war, and that's why they had to take him off the air. Olbermann says, look, his show, yes, was the highest rated show at the time, but it wasn't that highly rated. But much more importantly, it cost a ton of money because it had a huge advertising budget. It had a studio audience that was live, and hence it was a much, much bigger budget and couldn't be justified. Now, the flip side to that is Phil Donahue's producer at the time has unearthed memos from MSNBC executives saying, we can't have this guy speaking against the war on our air. So that's a pretty damaging memo. And look, understand, in my opinion, there isn't a black and white here. It's not like one side is right and the other side is wrong. My guess is, as most things, it's a combination of factors, right? And then finally you get to Ashley Banfield. And Keith says, look, I was there at the time. Before she gave her now legendary speech against the Iraq War, they had already agreed that they were going to part ways from MSNBC, that her contract was not going to be renewed. Now, technically, they did not renew her contract after she gave the speech. But he says he personally had a conversation with her where she knew that it wasn't getting renewed. Okay, and again, both sides could have validity. But when I look at in the details, I trust that Olbermann is saying things that are, that are right from his perspective. I don't question what he's saying at all. And I mean, look, you remember why, too. Because Olbermann is the guy who turned MSNBC around. He's the one that did the special comments, and that is, and obviously a real progressive. I don't think he still works for MSNBC. Of course, he has a lot of loyalty to MSNBC, but understand all the factors and the biases that go into it. But there's a reason why Olbermann has the kind of credibility that he has. In fact, there's a story about how he quit MSNBC the first time around because all they did was Monica Lewinsky stories. So everybody's got great credibility here. But when I look at it, not in those details, but in the overall picture, what I see is MSNBC that got rid of Jesse Ventura, even though he had a contract, but paid him out. Phil Donahue, even though he was the highest rated show, but it was expensive. Ashley Banfield, who was also against the war. Did they know before she was against the war before she did her speech? Why did they get rid of her contract in the first place? And then much more importantly for me, after she wanted to get out of the contract, be released and go somewhere else. Why didn't they let her out of the contract? Why did she, now this is her side of it. Why did they literally moved her office to a closet, she says. Why did they do that? So when you put all this together, what I get is and by the way, the guys that they hired is Michael Savage. So on the other hand, they also hired Keith Olbermann, who wound up being a very strong progressive. Now, having said all that, look, the bottom line for me is, did MSNBC want to go further right at that point? Did they want to try to compete with Fox News by trying to be more conservative? Absolutely. I mean, look, as much as I respect everybody's perspective on it, you'd have to be blind not to see that. And I don't think even Olbermann really doubts that. And he said at one point in one of the responses, he said, well, look, obviously MSNBC was going further right? So I think almost everybody can agree to that. I guess the question is, did that cause them to end all those contracts or to not put those people on air? Given the memos, given the situation, I think it was at least partly responsible for that. I mean, it's a lot of coincidences that add up to that. Now, as you know, as not just luck would have it, but as Olbermann would have it, they wound up turning their primetime progressive anyway. Their morning is not, their news is not, but their primetime is. So it wound up being okay. But was the media there against having a position against the war? And was MSNBC a part of that? I think absolutely, yes. Okay? And but that goes exactly to my point, which is that the MSNBC, and I hope that Olbermann and the people at MSNBC don't think that that's how we think of it, like that they get in a room and they go, okay, let's conspire, right? At least not from my perspective. I can't speak for Jesse Ventura. But they make the decisions that the executives want, to go in a general direction. And they didn't want to put opinions out there that were against the war. And so they didn't. And the way that manifested itself is in all those little decisions, or at least contributing to those decisions. And then the final product was a media, including MSNBC, that did not speak out against the war. There is no disputing that. And that was a gross failure of the media. And not just in not presenting, it wasn't the media's job to say, hey, we're against the war, but to at least present that perspective. And the second failure, which I think is even larger, is to present the truth. Because remember, when we went to the Iraq War, 69% of Americans thought that Saddam Hussein was personally responsible for 9/11. Now, who's responsible for getting the American people information? The press. They failed terribly at that job. Now, some, like MSNBC, ironically, have improved. Others have not. I think those are the obvious facts.